Hi everyone, we're back for another video on science communication. So last time we talked about methods and you've gotten a little bit of writing practice in terms of how to write a method section for a paper. Now, when we're talking about papers or oral presentations or poster presentations for science communication, you have the same basic ideas in terms of what you put into them, but you express them very differently. And so that's what we're going to talk about today in preparation for having you put together method sections for an oral presentation and a poster presentation. So in class on Friday, we talked about how you always write to your audience. And so we specifically talked about the differences in the audiences for these three kinds of science communication. And so we said, if you have a paper, the people who read that paper are people who are interested in the topic that you wrote about, and very specifically, people who are interested enough that they will actually search out your paper. For an oral presentation, it's very similar in that it's rare that you get someone in your presentation who's not interested in the topic, although it does happen. When you're presenting at a conference, usually your presentation is part of a large session, and so people may come to see 2 or 3 talks in the session, and your talk might be sandwiched in between. So, there could be some part of the audience that's not necessarily there for you. But people do have a choice about which sessions they can go to, and they actively choose to sit in the session where you're giving your presentation. So again, it's usually people who are at least interested in the general topic, even if not your particular subject. And then for posters, a lot of times they're presented during a poster session where there's a whole bunch of different posters on many different topics. And so what happens is you get a lot of people going by, and some of them may look at your poster to see what's there and see if it's interesting. So a lot of people who see your poster may not necessarily be initially interested in your poster unless you do something to grab them. So that is very different from the other two sorts of science communication. So we did talk about those differences in your audience in class on Friday, but the thing that we didn't talk about is the difference in how the audience, whatever that may be, engages with your paper, presentation, or poster. So let's talk about that right now. Basically, when you have a paper and you're sitting down to read a paper, one of the things that's unique about this particular sort of science communication is that you have an unlimited amount of time to go through that paper and figure out what it's trying to say. I mean, theoretically infinite, right? I mean, of course, everyone has deadlines that they're trying to work within, but you can spend a couple hours, and then go back the following day and spend another couple hours looking for something else. The papers that I have used as foundational in my work, I have often read, a dozen or more times, each time going through and finding new things to highlight. So there's a lot of time to process the information. And that's good because the other thing about a paper is the author is not there. Yes, there is a corresponding author. You can email them. I have done that a couple of times in my life, but most of the time we don't do that. Most of the time we just try and process the material in the paper by ourselves. When you have an oral presentation, this is very different in that you have a much more limited time frame to process the information. So basically the presenter gets, well, it really depends on your conference. There's often like somewhere between a 10 to 20 minute time slot, and they ask you not to use the entire time slot because of course they want time for Q&A. So you're usually looking at like 10 or 15 minutes to get across your basic points. And by the way, 15 minutes is super, super lucky. And then you have your Q&A, as I said before. So even though you're doing it in a very compressed fashion, at least the audience has a chance to ask you questions about the things that they don't understand. So that is definitely different than a paper. So now let's talk about a poster. Posters are presented in poster sessions at conferences. A lot of times the poster is put up well in advance of the poster session and possibly left up after the poster session so that people can go through and look at the posters even when the poster session is not going. So some people come through when it's quiet. I actually like doing that myself. When I do that, the author is not present. So there's a chance that people who see your poster will not get a chance to do Q&A. And so it is going to need to be understandable without you there. But the other thing about a poster is that there's no fixed amount of time that you are going to be able to present that information to the audience, right? A poster session is usually 2 or 3 hours long, and during that time, you're going to have a constant flow of people going through. Some of them will stop, they'll look at your poster for like 2 minutes, that's all you get. Some people sit there and talk to you for 15-20 minutes or more. I've definitely had some really long conversations with people who are doing work that is closely related to mine. So you get everyone from looky-loos to super, super interested people, and your poster has to accommodate all of that. So let's talk about oral presentations, and specifically how you need to think about formatting an oral presentation so that your audience can get the most out of what you're saying. So a principle you need to understand is that despite everything we say about multitasking, when it comes to serious mental exertion, our brains can really only process one thing at a time. And in an oral presentation, there are 2 things going on that people could want to process. The first part is the slides. So when you think about it, when people talk about giving an oral presentation, they'll often say things like, oh, I'm giving a PowerPoint, right? They talk about the slides as though those are the focus of the presentation. And yet, if that were so, all we would need to do is put up our PowerPoint slides, like print them out and just tack them up for people to look at. Because the second thing that's going on is that the speaker is actually talking. And it's important to understand as you put together an oral presentation that you are the one who's giving the presentation, not your slides, but you. So the slides are your backup. You want your audience to listen to everything that you are saying with the slides to support your most important points. So your audience should look at the slides. They should want to take in the information on the slides, but they also should not spend a lot of time doing that. Because if you spend all that time doing that, then by the time they process the information that they see visually in front of them, you will have talked through half of the things that they're saying, and they will miss what you are saying. So you try and make your slides very easily understandable so they can look at it, get the overall gist, and still listen to what you're saying. So you want to make your slides very simple, and there are 3 good ways you can think about doing this. First of all, make everything easy to read. Even if you have easily understandable material, if the audience can't read the words that you put on the slide, then they're going to spend their time squinting and trying to figure out what that word says and whatever, and they're not listening to you. Secondly, make the meaning of that text very easy to understand. So it's not just enough to have readable things if it's just gobbledygook. If it's readable gobbledygook, still not good. And the final thing to do is to use as few words as possible. And you do that by replacing words, and I'm going to say numbers too, I'll show you this in a little bit. Replacing those words or numbers with some sort of non-wordy, non-numerical, visual thing like a picture, a graph, or a diagram. So let's go into those three things a little more. The first thing is you have to make the text easy to read. One of the things you can do there is to make a large font size. Now, if you're not sure if the font size is big enough, it's really hard to test your presentation under the conditions under which you're going to be giving it. So you're probably not going to have advanced access to the conference hall where you're presenting. You won't be able to stand at the back of the room and say, can I read this or not? So what you can do is put it on your normal size monitor, whatever that could be, a laptop or your desktop or whatever, and stand back 5 or 6 feet and see if you can read it from 5 or 6 feet back. And if you can see it on a small screen from 5 or 6 feet, then you'll probably be able to read it on a big screen in a presentation area. The second thing is you should have good color contrast between the text and the background. And this is something that I see is a real issue, in that a lot of people are so busy trying to make their slides look beautiful that they don't think about how readable it is in terms of the contrast. So here's an example of a bad slide, and you can see the title part has a large font, but it's a font that's not easily readable. And then the body of the slide, right, number one, uses small fonts, which, maybe you youngins could do pretty well. But, once you start getting into middle age like me, I really have a hard time reading some of the slides that my students put up. And you may not be able to see this, but in the body of this bad slide, there are actually 3 paragraphs. And the third paragraph is very hard to read because there's not good contrast between the text and the background. Here's a good slide. It's not as pretty, but you can read everything on it. If you want to put a picture in, you can, but there are ways to do that. And we'll talk about formatting presentations and posters, etc. Later on in the quarter. Right now we're mostly going for content, and then we'll worry about form at a later date. So again, you want the meaning of your words to be very clear so that they can be easily understood. So usually the way that you do this is to have as few words on your slide as possible. First of all, limit each of your bullet points to 1 line or less. It doesn't have to be a full line. And second of all, don't put more than 4 or 5 bullet points per slide. Now, a lot of students, when they first hear me say this, they're like, but then I can't fit everything on there. But when you say things like that, it's clear that you misunderstand how an oral presentation is given. Because remember, the slides are your backup. You, the presenter, are the primary source of information. The slides are the backup. So because they're the backup, you do not have to put everything on there. You just have to put just the merest summary on there, and everything else will come from you as the presenter. So the third point, if you'll remember, was to replace words or numbers with pictures, graphs, and diagrams. People understand this concept better when they're replacing words. So, for example, they'll say, my method section, I could make a flow chart or something like that. They understand it less with numbers. I see a lot of tables in PowerPoints, and it's really interesting. Now, if you look at this data, which I actually got from a student's lab, this is spectrophotometer data where they're looking at the absorbance at different wavelengths. And now if you look at this data, try and figure out where the peak absorbance is. How long does it take you? Now let's take those numbers and let's replace them with a graph. You can pick up that peak absorbance within just a second or two of me popping it on the screen. You definitely should not just throw a graph on the screen and say, and here's my peak absorbance. We'll talk later about best practices in presenting a graph. But in the meantime, as we sit here and think about how to encapsulate our information in a PowerPoint slide, just think about replacing words and numbers with as many pictures, graphs, or diagrams as you can. Now, if you're not sure whether your PowerPoint is clear or not, there is a really easy way to test it. You need a second person, and you're going to go through the PowerPoint with that person, and they're going to have a sheet of paper in front of them. And what they're going to do is every time you put up a slide, rather than nitpicking all the little details on it, although they could do that, they're going to look at that slide and they're going to write down the one, no more than one sentence, takeaway message from that slide. And they can get that message from the slide or they can get it from you. But this is one way that you can think about, hey, what are people actually understanding from my presentation? Because if what you're trying to say and what they get out of it are two different things, that's a problem. So often when I write slides, the way I structure it is, okay, what's the takeaway message going to be from this slide? What can I put on this slide that supports that takeaway message? And that's a complete reframing of how most people think about how to get information onto a slide deck. Okay, so now let's talk about poster sessions. Now, I kind of hinted before at how poster sessions run, so let's do a deeper dive into how this works. So this is actually the Ocean Sciences meeting in 2016. I love this picture because there was that big catwalk up high where you can look down into the entire poster hall, so you can see how many posters there are. Not all of these were presented at the same poster session. All of these posters were presented over the course of the entire week. But basically, you have a whole bunch of posters all set up, and at a particular time, you're going to stand by your poster and talk about it. So in advance, you're given the size that you may use for your poster. So sometimes they'll have one of these boards per poster, and in this particular case, they had very wide boards, and we each got half of a board, but we knew that in advance, so we knew we got a 4x4 space. And you can see there's a sign here that says when I will actually be at my poster to present it. So if someone comes through and looks at your poster while no one else is in the poster hall and they have a question, they know when to come back to get more information. So back to a poster session, what is it like, not when you're a presenter, but when you're actually visiting to look at posters? Well, you have a whole bunch of people who are presenting their posters at the same time. And so there are maybe, 100, 200 posters being presented at any given time. And you can see how narrow these aisles are. So now imagine a couple thousand people clustered around a couple hundred posters. What is that like? Well, here we have, about 8 or 10 feet between the rows of posters. There are people standing next to the posters to present them, and then you have this traffic going past. You're walking past, you're looking at the posters. You're trying to see if this is a poster you're interested in or one you're going to go past and skip because you can't see all 100 posters. And so if you think about it from this point of view, as a presenter, what you need to understand is most people are only going to see your poster from the distance of, 4, 5, 6 feet away. There are large portions of your poster that only maybe 2 or 3 people out of those 2,000 will actually read. So you want key takeaway points to be easily understood from a distance. And even if you get someone who's super interested in your poster, it's not really good to have paragraphs of really tiny font that they need to get in really close and squint at in order to read. So what you want to do is you want to put things in bullet points, kind of like you would in a PowerPoint presentation. You want to have as many pictures, graphs, whatever, as possible, kind of like in a PowerPoint presentation. So a lot of the practices that are good practices in oral presentations are also good practices in giving poster presentations. Now, I will say that you can get away with more text on the poster than you can on the oral presentation. And in fact, it is good to have more text on the poster because you may not be at your poster when people come by. So it is slightly different. So here's an example of maybe not the best poster in the world. I intentionally cut off the person's name so that they weren't shamed. As you can see, this is something where I had to get really close to it to actually read, and it was very hard to understand from far away. It does have graphs, it does have pictures, but there's really big clumps of text. So, when you're setting up a poster, you are going to have those same sections that a paper would have, as we talked about last week. So you're going to have the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. Some people put their abstract on the poster, some don't. It will go in the conference proceedings. So you will have an abstract one way or another, but whether you actually print it on your poster is a different story. Now, what you need to know about sections when you're thinking about posters is that your sections should be clear. In a paper, there's a heading that says introduction, and you read through and you say, here's the introduction, I'm going to read through. Oh, now we're switching to methods. In a presentation, you're going to have these same 4 sections, and you're going to first present the introductory material, and then you're going to present the methods. Like, they have no choice but to follow in that order. But posters are different because you can put those sections in any order you want on the poster. You need to visually show where each section is. So a lot of people use text boxes. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes you can just use clean white space. That is a personal preference, how you separate things out. But you want to think about the flow of how people will read, right? So you're going to put them in a logical order, moving left to right or top to bottom. So some people do, introduction, and then methods below, and then results over to the right, and then discussion below that. Or you could do introduction in the top left and methods in the top right. So then you're going left to right, and then you do results discussion, bottom, left to right, whatever. But just know that, if you put your introduction in the lower right-hand corner, that's not where people are going to start. They're going to start with something else. And so think about the way we read, right? In different cultures where they have different ways of writing things, like if you're in Arabic, you make your graphs what we would consider in the West backwards. You'd have the origin for your graphs in the lower right of the graph instead of the lower left, because they read right to left. But because we read left to right, you're going to start everything and near the top, and you're going to go to the bottom and towards the right. Okay, so here's kind of a classic example of a poster where you can see that the sections, even if you can't read the font because this is a lot smaller than the original, you can see clearly where the sections are, and they are clearly delineated from each other. Here is another poster. Most of these posters are from the 2019 Astrobiology Science Conference. So this one is a little interesting in that they don't actually label it introduction, methods, results, and discussion. But you can see there's the why, that's the introduction, why they studied it. And then in the how well portion, they talk about the methods and the results. And then in the do extreme extracellular enzymes function, that's more of the discussion. So even though they renamed it, it's the same sections, basically. there's a trend in posters where people are starting to put one big takeaway message somewhere on the poster so that, even if people do not ever stop to read the fine print, they get one takeaway message. So you can see that here kind of in the top center where they say benthic microbial mats grow in an ultra oligotrophic environment but don't fix nitrogen. These extreme conditions require tight nitrogen recycling in the mat. So there's your takeaway message. Now, if you look at this, then they also go through, here's the introduction where they're talking about the motivation, they call it. Here's the method, so they're going left to right across the top. And then on the bottom, they're going to give you the results and the discussion, although they don't label them as that. Here's someone who's taken the takeaway message to an extreme, right? Here's your takeaway message right in the middle, and you can see off to the side, they've got a very short introduction, very short methods, very short results, very short discussion. So you can see that there are many different ways to do this. Different people have different aesthetic ideas about how a poster should look, but a really good poster, you're going to be able to see from far away and get some good takeaways without going straight up and, basically sticking your nose up against the poster to read the fine print. So, your assignment is to take those 3 standard operating procedures that I gave you earlier in the week, and you're going to use them to create a poster method section and an oral presentation method section. You're going to do both of these in some sort of presentation software like PowerPoint or Google Slides, because that's actually what we use to make posters, not just presentations. So for the presentation, you can have multiple slides. For the poster, also think about, could you get that information onto one slide? Okay, that is the tricky part. Okay, but try it and see what you can come up with.